You have probably heard of the high to late medieval guilds that existed all across Europe. If you have not, then I made a video about that. However, the complicated structure of the high and late medieval period occupation guilds, like merchant guilds or craft guilds, evolved from a much more simpler style of guild that emerged in the early medieval period. Due to this simpler structure of oftentimes non-occupation centric guilds of the early medieval period, some historians call these early guilds guilds as to differentiate the two. A guild is an organization of multiple members, often but not always, with a founding charter or a formal agreement and a swearing of oaths that was set up in a horizontal structure with certain goals in mind. These goals could be anything from simple drinking clubs to trying to lower the crime rate in a city by policing it. These guilds, in pursuing their founding goals, could act in collaboration with the state and/or the church, or be independent from them, or even act against them. How these early medieval guilds formed is hard to say, as there are limited sources on them, and the interpretation of these sources usually depends on how a historian views the migration period and the fall of the Western Roman Empire. To explain, there are two major historical interpretations of the migration period and its outcome. These two interpretations are described by Halsall as movers and shakers. To quote Halsall, "Movers believe that the changes of late antiquity may be ascribed to the movement into the Roman Empire of largely Germanic barbarians. The barbarians, viewed as numerically significant migrating peoples, are at least the catalyst for change. Shakers, on the other hand, believe that tensions and changes within the Roman Empire were already shaking it to its core, and the barbarians, usually seen as small, elite warrior groups, were but a symptom, if perhaps a focus, of these changes." Of course, not all historians fall neatly into these two categories, and there's much more nuance to it, but all you need to know for this video is that there are these two interpretations of the migration period and the fall of the Western Roman Empire. So with that said, historians who prefer the Shakers interpretation largely see the early medieval guilds as stemming from, if not directly connected to, the late Roman collegia. The collegia were Roman institutions closely resembling, in structure, the well-known occupation guilds of the high to late medieval ages. They functioned as social clubs, religious collectives, trade unions, and even sometimes as lobbying bodies. They were basically collective institutions that could act as legal entities which could hold property or sue other people/institutions. They often sprang up in urban centers and could in reality be doing anything. There were collegia of gravediggers and merchants, as well as of cultists and religious institutions. These collegia also survived well into the Middle Ages in a bit of a different form in the Eastern Roman Empire, or in other words, the Byzantine Empire, but I won't mention them as I'm talking about the West in this video. The proponents of the movers interpretation talk about the early medieval guilds as either stemming from older Germanic practices or being independently created within the newly formed early medieval Germanic kingdoms after the Roman tradition of collegia died out. Hence, the early medieval guilds have no connection to the Roman collegia. Neither of these two theories on the origins of the early medieval guilds can be proven at the moment, as not much research has been done into the topic and no source has been discovered that would outright prove or disprove one or the other. With that said, early medieval guilds still existed, so let's look at what they were and what they did. The early medieval guilds, unlike their later counterparts, weren't centered around an occupation, meaning the guilds that were formed in the early medieval Germanic kingdoms weren't guilds of solely merchants or cobblers or blacksmiths, etc. These guilds, rather than an occupation, had largely geographical separations, meaning anyone within the geographical area of the guild's operation could, in theory, join the guild if they wanted to, no matter what their occupation was. And I do mean anyone. Early medieval guilds, even though largely consisting of free urban class, also included serfs, clergymen, lower level aristocrats, and even women, which is unusual given the nature of later medieval guilds, which often outright banned women in any participation. Firstly, I'll mention what I call protection or military guilds, but are also called peace guilds. The goal of some early medieval guilds involved some kind of mutual protection, sometimes with a fairly militaristic character. The most famous of these protection guilds were London's Frith guilds of the 10th century. They were established by a group of like-minded individuals who kept law and order within the community instead of relying solely on the support of the local sheriff or alderman. London wasn't the only place where these kinds of guilds were established, nor were these kinds of guilds unique to urban centers. Similar guilds were established across the Frankish lands in rural areas. These guilds were a form of people's organized law and order enforcement, often in place where the state, in other words the king, was unable to provide sufficient enough protection. Speaking of providing sufficient enough protection, just like the protection guilds of London, you yourself should consider your own online protection with NordVPN. NordVPN is a simple to use VPN service with over 5,200 servers in 60 different countries. You want to watch something that is unavailable in your country? No problem, NordVPN has got you covered. You want to play a game that is geo-restricted? No problem, with NordVPN not only can you play the game, but also, thanks to their new NordLynx feature and the fact that they're upgrading to 10 gigabit per second servers, you're also not gonna suffer as much lag spikes. NordVPN can be downloaded on 6 different devices with 1 subscription and is available for all major operating systems. So to protect yourself in the digital world, go to nordvpn.com/laserhistory and use the coupon code LASERHISTORY to get a 2-year plan plus 4 months usually discounted. If you feel like not typing all that out, no problem. Just click the link at the top of the description or in the pinned comment. Thank you so much for NordVPN for sponsoring this video. Going back to the protection guilds, some kings embraced these guilds, like, for example, the London ones, which got officially recognized by King Aethelstan. But other protection guilds weren't as lucky and got cracked down upon, sometimes very harshly. This was because they were often viewed by kings as a form of unsanctioned vigilantism and or threats to royal authority within the area of their operation. For example, when the peasants of the Loire Valley established the protection guild in the 9th century against Viking raids from which King Odo of France was unable to protect them, they were, quote, massacred by the king for daring to establish an institution that was unsanctioned by him and, according to him, competed with his authority in the area. Lastly, the most militaristic example of these protection guilds were the Saxon companion guilds. This kind of guild emerged in the Duchy of Saxony after it was incorporated into the Frankish Empire in 804. It was a sort of military institution of free men and peasants that preceded the men-at-arms of the High Middle Ages. They acted as a protection force, as a raiding force, as a policing force, and also as a military political force. For example, the Saxon companion guilds helped Emperor Lothar I in a war against his brother Louis the German. To some, these military guilds may seem more like roaming bands of soldiers than actual guilds, but despite their militaristic and often banded nature, the companion guilds were still institutions that resembled guilds in almost every way. They held meetings, collected fees, elected officials, and had set goals in mind. Plus, their militaristic nature was by far not unique, as even later medieval guilds like the Hansa could and did go to war, sometimes against entire kingdoms. Next, I'll talk about the most common type of guilds in the early Middle Ages, religious guilds. These guilds were divided between ones formed by the clergymen and ones by the common people. Of course, an overlap between the two existed. The religious guilds created by clergymen were formed as sort of discussion clubs where clergymen could meet for meals in either guild halls or other predetermined meeting places, discuss their ministry, theology, and get help preparing sermons. On the other hand, the religious guilds formed by common people were sort of prayer groups largely connected with parish churches and often established by wealthy individuals like barons or bishops. The goal of these lay religious guilds for the participants was to become more connected to the church and become more attuned with God, but their duty was also to pray for the lives of their founder/patron and his family. This was not unusual in the Middle Ages. Many wealthy people established or funded hospitals, abbeys, monasteries, colleges, and religious guilds in order that they have people praying for them and their family. It was a sort of religious investment or insurance to make sure that even if you did something sinful, you balanced it out with your investment. On the other side of the spectrum from religious guilds, you had social guilds or drinking guilds. These pretty much acted as what we would today call fraternities or eating clubs. Members would contribute a common fund, officers would be chosen to govern the proceedings and manage assets, wealthier guilds would use their assets to buy/build guild halls for their events, and some swearing of oaths and/or rituals and/or hazing of new members could have been conducted. These kinds of early social guilds also often acted as insurance cooperatives, where members of the guild swore to pay for each other's legal proceedings when they got in trouble, or compensate each other in case of a house fire, or pay for each other's funerals when a guild member died, etc. Social/drinking guilds weren't liked by the church much because, as one clergyman, the Alcuin of York, wrote complaining to Archbishop of Canterbury in the 8th century, these curious meetings, which they are accustomed to and have called guilds, were seducing people away from prayer in church and leading them instead to drunken parties in surrounding hills, thereby undermining episcopal authority. Naturally, the descriptions of the different types of guilds I gave in this video are simplifications of a much more complicated reality. All early medieval guilds were unique with often ever-changing goals and members, and therefore my general overview of these guilds will not always 100% apply to any specific individual guild. On top of that, the main three guild types I talked about could and often did have large overlaps. Protection guilds had a fairly large social character to them, while social/drinking guilds often had a very religious aspect to them, with members being required to conduct frequent prayers. And some religious guilds could have fairly wild social events. According to one source, priests in guilds had been attending raucous parties either alone or with laymen, where they drank to the saints or their own souls, got into fights and told stories to rouse the applause. Others indulged in entertainments involving bears and dancing girls or even demonic masks. Take this quote with a pinch of salt, however. This source comes from an archbishop who was arguing against the existence of religious guilds, and therefore his account is an over-exaggeration. But it does go to show that the events of religious guilds could have possibly gotten quite debaucherous sometimes. From these early medieval guilds of Western Europe evolved the later and much more well-known occupation guilds. For example, the job of the London Peace Guilds or Thrift Guilds eventually got taken over by London livery companies, which were essentially occupation guilds. The specific social guilds that acted more like insurance cooperatives evolved into merchant or craft guilds, which, on top of other things, still insured members' assets and still kept a very strong social dynamic reminiscent of the early social guilds. Just watch my Life of a Hansa Merchant video to see just how strong these social aspects of the later medieval guilds were. With that said, just like with the early medieval guilds and collegia, it is actually still debated whether the later occupation guilds did develop from these earlier, simpler guilds. However, considering that some of these early medieval guilds existed until the 11th and 12th century, which is the same time when the first occupation guilds started to form, I think it is safe to say that even if not directly connected, the early medieval guilds created a social institution which formed the basis upon which the later more economically focused and powerful occupation guilds, like the Hansa, were created. Before I say anything, thank you to NordVPN for sponsoring this video. So far it has been a rough 2021 for me, hence the lack of videos, but hopefully that will change now. I know I said that before, but I'm trying. It doesn't always work out sometimes, you know? However, my next video is a banger. I have worked on it for almost a year now, so look forward to that. I also have to give extremely large thanks to my patrons and my members on YouTube, whose financial support has been extremely helpful this year due to all the things I had to deal with. So thank you so much to those people. Other than that, my name is Laser, and stick around for history.